I've done hundreds, if not thousands, of assessments, church planting assessments, pastoral assessments. And by and large, pastors and church planters in particular are elevated on the narcissistic spectrum.
Welcome. You're listening to The Glass House, hosted by Lifeway. We're Ben and Lindley Mandrell, and we have conversations with leaders who have experienced the stress of ministry and have sensed a spotlight on their personal lives. We want to encourage ministry families and provide a glimpse inside their glass house. And before we start this episode, I want to invite you to participate in the conversation. If you have feedback to offer, a general question for Lindley or me, or if there's a topic you'd like for us to tackle in the future, email us at president@lifeway.com. We read every one of those emails. Today on the show, we're excited to have Chuck DeGroat join us. He's talking about narcissism and the toxicity it can bring to a ministry context. Chuck's a therapist. He spends a lot of his time counseling pastors and their spouses who are caught up in the snares of narcissism. It's easy to do, and he writes a lot on the subject. What's also unique about Chuck is that he was a pastor before he got involved in counseling and teaching. So I'm excited for you to hear the insight he brings to this conversation. So today on the show, we have Chuck DeGroat. Chuck, tell us a little bit about you and how you got into writing about this kind of thing.
Yeah, well, thank you both for having me. It's good to be with you. Thanks for the work that you do. Thanks for highlighting the complicated lives of pastors.
We were talking about this before the show started, but narcissism, like we were talking about this, it's almost like gluten. Like 20 years ago, nobody was talking about gluten. And 20 years ago, nobody was talking about narcissism. It really is a huge topic now that is hitting all kinds of areas of ministry. So maybe help us understand a little bit about what is narcissism for the listener.
Yeah, well, that's good. I'm gluten-free, so hopefully I'm narcissism-free too. But you're right. I mean, we weren't talking about it, although, I say, the conversation goes back to Genesis chapter 3. I mean, it goes back to this sense of Adam and Eve in the midst of this sense of scarcity, feeling like God was holding out on them. The serpent slithers up and whispers in their ear, "Surely God hasn't told you to eat from that tree." You know the story, right? It goes back to that old story of I'm going to grasp for the thing that I think I need, and we see this in the stories of leaders and kings throughout the Old Testament. So narcissism is a new word to describe a very old phenomenon that when we look at kind of the psychological categories, feature things like grandiosity, attention seeking, lack of empathy, entitlement. Those are some of the main characteristics, but I really try to distill out other layers of narcissism because I don't always think it comes in a package of grandiosity and superiority. In fact, I think it could come in other kinds of packages that don't look quite as extreme, but are nevertheless manipulative and toxic. And so, but that really gets to the core of it.
You talked about narcissism in a grandiose form.
Yeah.
I mean, what does it look like in a non-grandiose form? I mean, when you're saying that what does that look like?
Yeah, I think the main characteristic that I see is a kind of smug superiority, or even a kind of martyr victim complex. Imagine the pastor, an example might help, right? I've seen it in smaller churches, pastor of the small church, 40, 50 people, but we are the true church. And no one else gets the gospel like we get the gospel. And no one likes us and no one gets us. And so it's not this sense of we're the biggest church in town. I've got the largest platform. There's more of a sense that no one really appreciates how great I really am. You see the difference there?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And that victim mindset, sometimes narcissism is, I can't be confronted because then I'm the victim of this larger narrative, right?
Yeah. There's always this sense that the narcissist is I think three pieces: the hero, the victim, and the martyr in the story. And so they can play all three roles when it suits them best. And it's so interesting to me that narcissists do tend to have this kind of superiority complex, but there's always this sense that they're being hurt, they're being misunderstood, they're being abused, they're being beat up, they're being victimized along the way. And so that dynamic is pretty prominent.
We were fascinated that in church planting specifically, there is a proclivity for there to be a higher degree of narcissism.
Yeah.
And
Which
Lindley
we
and I-
understand. 'Cause
we confessed this on the show, but
yeah.
we couldn't help but make our church plant, it was hard to set the boundary between where we began and where the church plant began. Like we were the same.
Mm,
Well, and at the end, we talked about this in our first podcast. It was going so well. Like, I mean, it was growing and by all measures was doing so well
right.
that we really had kind of eliminated God from the equation.
Yeah.
And so, now we look back and are like, gosh, we were so narcissistic. Like we just believed it was because of us,
Yeah.
which is so ungodly. And
Yeah.
but you just get wrapped up into it and you don't even realize that's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and let me say this, and I don't know you two very well at all, right? But I think the capacity to be self-reflective, like you're being self-reflective right now, and like you were at the beginning of our time together. I mean, I think there's a sense that those who have the capacity to look at their lives with some sense of humility and say, "This is might be what I've got myself into, or what I'm prone to." But I think by definition, you're probably not narcissistic personality disorder. What I've found, and this gets to the church planning piece, is that I've done hundreds, if not thousands, of assessments, church planning assessments, pastoral assessments, and by and large, pastors and church planters in particular are elevated on the narcissistic spectrum. That doesn't mean that they're narcissistic personality disorder, but we don't see dependent personality disorder. We don't see schizoid personality disorder. We see narcissism. We see histrionic. We see turbulent. We see these kinds of personalities that are prone to drama and stimulation and the stage and things like that. And I think it's fair to say that maybe a little bit of narcissism is okay. I get in trouble for this sometimes. Like people will push back and they'll say, "Well, you talk about how can there be healthy narcissism?" I think that what we see is some confidence, a sense of capacity to get up on a stage. That's a big deal to be able to get up on
Yeah.
a stage and say, "This is the word of the Lord," or whatever you say in your tradition, right? But combined with humility, that's okay.
Yeah.
When there's a lack of humility, empathy, self-awareness, that's where we run into problems.
Can you tell a story, maybe, Chuck? Someone who, in that narcissistic bent, lacked empathy. Like, what does it look like to lack empathy? Where have you seen that
Yeah,
show up?
yeah. Well, that's sort of the hidden part of the narcissism package that people don't think of when they're sort of classically defining it. They think of grandiosity and superiority, but this is the person who doesn't really have the capacity to hear you when you so your situation from a number of years back, and I always sort of combine stories so that no one listening could say he's talking about me. But an assistant pastor on staff with a lead pastor, the assistant pastor over the course of a couple of years experienced this lead pastor as domineering. Every time the assistant pastor would come with an idea, somehow the lead pastor would present it as his idea.
Right.
Somewhere along the way, there were these things that happened. And so I was the therapist actually for the assistant pastor at the time. And I said, what would it look like for you to share with him? Here's my experience of you. And because of the lead pastor's lack of empathy, there was no capacity to sit with him and say, "Oh man, I'm so sorry. I can't believe that you've experienced me in that way. I'm impacting you in that way. I've hurt you in this way. What do we need to do? How do we?" There was no capacity for that. And that's what I mean by a lack of empathy. Like they're so defended. And so when the assistant pastor came to him to say, "Hey, can I give you some feedback?" It was taken as an accusation, which eventually led to the
Mm,
assistant pastor's termination.
mm.
It was a missed opportunity for humility, for curiosity.
This is what makes
Wow.
it really difficult to fulfill Jesus' command to go and be reconciled.
Yeah,
Is sometimes when you're dealing with someone like that who doesn't literally have the tools of empathy
yeah,
available to them,
yeah.
it's impossible to end it in the Hallmark movie, isn't it?
It's impossible, yeah, because I think psychologically speaking, a narcissist by definition is just so defended. I mean, just picture this fortress that they had to put up, probably because of their own life experiences, probably done unwittingly. In other words, they didn't decide at 7 years old, 10 years old, I'm going to put up a fortress and live like a warrior with my sword up all the time. But there is a sense that they're living like that in the world. I often say, though, behind the fortress walls is a little boy, a little girl, someone who's scared to death, and that's why you get these kinds of reactions. It's a strange thing to be able to say, he can be a bully, but he's also just a little boy who's so scared. We're kind of seeing this play out. Some of the podcasts that are out there about some of these larger churches and the dynamics within them.
Yeah.
That's interesting. There's been a person in our past, I said, he's maybe the most confident and secure person I know. Because on stage, he comes across, but then there's all these things behind the scenes that he needs affirmation on. And so it kind of sounds like what you're saying a little bit.
I love that, Lindley. I mean, that's confident and secure. That's the perfect sort of combo that gets at what we're talking about. Yeah.
Our friends, as we've talked through this, we talk about dignity and depravity. That's one thing our counselor has worked with us on, is that every person has the ability to exhibit both. Will you talk a little bit more about that broken little boy? That's behind that mask. Like, what's going on there?
Yeah, dignity and depravity. That's so important, because I think when I come to this conversation, I want to say clearly, I don't think that narcissism defines someone to the core. It's like it's not their ontological sense of being, right? I think image bearer defines us at our core. And I think that that's how God sees us ultimately. And yet there's this pattern that we can live out of. And that's really what narcissism ends up being, is a kind of trauma-based pattern of living in the world that's ultimately self-sabotaging, that hurts the narcissist, that hurts others. And that's the depravity piece of things. And so it's a complicated dynamic in the sense of, like, people say to me, well, why do you want to counsel narcissists? Because I don't believe that that's who they are at their core. And I believe that there's a story, not only what I get on the surface, which is sometimes resistance, rage, but behind the scenes, when I sit long enough with someone who lets me in once and for all and says, Chuck, I'm just scared. And I've always been scared. And I'm beginning to feel like maybe this is one place where I can trust you, but I'm not even sure I can trust you, because I've learned never, ever to trust anyone.
That fragility is really just an expression of fear and the insecurity behind it, which we're all insecure.
Yeah, that's right.
Ways.
That's right.
Can the people-pleasing type person, in some regards, be a narcissist because they feel like, well, I can't say no?
Yeah.
And is deep down, are they believing that they're the only ones that can actually do that? Is that something you've come across in therapy?
Yeah. This is why it was helpful to kind of tease out the narcissistic faces through the Enneagram, because I think the people pleasing, well, that could be characteristic of a 2, right? Perhaps a couple of the other types too, but
the helper,
right? And I think that there can be this kind of helpful codependency. And this sense that if I come through for you, what we know about the 2 is that they meet other people's needs to meet their own needs. And so what the Enneagram reveals to us, every one of the types in the Enneagram reveal to us, is that these are styles of relating, styles of getting your needs met, right, in the world apart from God. And so, yeah, in a sense, each one of these reveals to us how we've gone about getting our needs met apart from God. And that doesn't make you a diagnosable narcissist, right? But it might show some tendencies in that direction that we see in the kinds of people who end up becoming ministers, helpers, caretakers in the church.
Chuck, I'm guessing that there's some listeners out there right now that have someone in mind as you're talking.
Yeah.
That's a narcissist. It might be a mother-in-law, a brother-in-law. It might be I'm not talking about mine.
Yeah, let's say.
It might be a pastor, a coworker. What encouragement do you give to people about putting boundaries up with someone who has narcissistic behavior? Like, how do they do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think the first thing that I'd say is that if that's your experience, it's really important to have someone else in your life, I'm talking about a therapist, a mentor, a spiritual director who gets these kinds of dynamics and who you can sit with and talk about how that impacts you, and talk about what are the kinds of decisions that I need to make to set a boundary, for instance, in the relationship. If there is a narcissistic person in your life, maybe a family member who's manipulating you, demanding something of you, it's important not to be alone in that relationship. I think in my work, so often I find people who come to me and they say, you're the first person I've talked to about this. No one believes me. It's just a really lonely place to be. And so it's important to tease that question out. I'd love to give you sort of a general one size fits all answer to that, but it's important to tease that out based on the particular kind of situation, because a boundary with one kind of narcissist may look different than a boundary with another kind.
Yeah.
And what we know about boundaries and narcissism is if you give an inch, they'll take a foot often. And so the boundary keeps moving in a sense. And they keep taking more and more and more. And they'll be exasperated and they'll give up. And I want to say, so, okay, so we have to revisit our whole conception of boundaries then, and what it means for you to be in relationship with this person and to preserve your own sense of dignity in the midst of that relationship.
Can I ask you a question about from the pastor's wife perspective?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
that's what we're talking a lot to pastors and pastors' wives. So,
yeah,
I mean, I think that I just make the assumption that typically the pastor is the narcissist.
yeah,
In that case, I mean, how does the marriage go? I mean, does the wife typically follow suit, or does that? I mean, have you found it to be
yeah.
really troubling, but hard marriages behind the scenes?
Yeah, it's a mix, really. I mean, so on the one hand, I've seen really toxic marriages where the wife was being abused by the narcissistic pastor and didn't want to be in the relationship and felt somehow compelled to be in the relationship because if you leave or you set a boundary, as we were talking about, that will reflect poorly on me and on our ministry. So you get that kind of situation sometimes in ministry, but you also have the pastor's spouse who colludes. And there's this dynamic of a kind of collective narcissism where um, the spouse can be the mirror to the narcissist. And I remember doing some work a number of years back with a lead pastor. We were getting somewhere in our counseling, but I remember he went home one time after a counseling session to his wife, and his wife said, "I don't want you to believe any more of that BS from that therapist. You need to go back, you need to double down, and you need to lead this church. No more of this." She used a bunch of words that I won't use, but basically saying, "Don't be weak." And in that sense, I mean, I think the spouse, his wife, was colluding with him and actually um, mostly unhelpful in the situation. Make sense?
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah, it
yeah.
makes total sense. For those who are listening who are like, am I a narcissist? Like, how do I be like truly faithful in
Yeah,
ministry without becoming that? Like, what are the practical steps to see it in yourself and
yeah.
keep rooting it out?
Yeah, that I love that you just described it that way because it is a really hard passage, and I think it's one that if you're humble, you'll say, I've been trying to live into that, and will be trying to live into that for the duration of my
Yes.
life, right? Like it's not something I think we achieve, but I love the language of Jesus did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, or
Mm,
another translation, exploited or taken advantage of. The word grasp is well, I mean, that's a bookend to Adam and Eve grasping in Genesis chapter 3, right?
that's good. That's
And
good.
and I have this sense that when I look at my life, there are seasons where I find myself grasping. There's these moments where you're in a staff meeting and things, you're losing a little bit of momentum in your church. People have left. The sermon series that you hoped would go well didn't go well, and
Right.
what can we do next? We gotta figure this out, And as we sort of confessed to one another earlier, this becomes all about us. And how can we figure this out on our own? And so I love Philippians 2 in the sense that it just continually calls us back to humility. How am I grasping? How am I
That's good.
manipulating? How am I controlling?
That's good.
That reminds me of the counselor that we have seen. He has 4 questions that people, I kind of what you're saying, like when you're grasping, you're asking a lot of what can I do more, better, different, I mean, all those kind of questions. And when
Mm.
you're doing that,
Strategies for improving myself to be
Oh,
enough.
okay. Yeah,
it sounded like what you were saying a little bit.
Yeah, it was.
that's right.
It's like when you're grasping, you are almost obsessing
Hmm.
over how am I going to make this happen when the New Testament never describes ministry in that way, does it?
Yeah.
It's more about a received ministry
Yes.
than something that we achieve.
Yeah. Yeah. And let's just confess this to one another. That's easier said than done. I mean, we
Yes.
preach that from the pulpit, right? But my default is to go back to how can I strategize? How can I manipulate? How can I grasp? We live with so much insecurity. And you used a really good word earlier, the word fragility. mean, I think in a sense, what I'm learning, I turned 50 last year, and I'm just beginning to learn just a little bit of what it means to live with a sense of fragility. Like, how do I befriend my limitations? How do I befriend my fragility? How's that not a bad thing? When I was a pastor in my early 30s, I thought I had to be superhuman.
Mm.
And now it's just more okay to be weak, to be vulnerable, to be limited.
Yeah.
And maybe age, even our bodies as they decay teach us a little something about this, right?
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
true. It really is. It humbles you to realize that we're all under the curse and we're only here for a little while.
that's right.
Going back to what you said earlier, I heard it said this way, I think is helpful that we can control the depth of our ministry, but the Lord controls the breadth of our ministry.
Mm,
And I do think grasping for breadth is where we really get it wrong.
And we've talked about that. I mean, because we are kind of recovering church planners.
yeah,
And so with this podcast, we're like, okay, well, we want it to be successful, but because we're putting time into it, but
right.
then but how successful do you want it to
Oh, yeah,
be? And then do I want to know the numbers or do I not? Because what
yeah,
is going to equal
yeah,
success? Like
yeah,
how many downloads is going to be good
yeah,
or good enough?
yeah.
And so it's hard.
That's right. And as Diane Langberg, who's been a mentor to so many of us, she's sort of like the godmother of this conversation. As Diane
Mm.
Langberg often says, is with more success comes more anxiety. We think it's going to be the panacea for our anxiety, and yet with more success, there's more of a sense of, well, I got to keep this going. Like what if I don't? What if we don't release a podcast this week? What if I don't tweet, 5 times today, or whatever it might be? And it's like a drug, and there is this
Yes.
kind of dopamine hit with, oh, we got
Yes.
10,000 views, we got 20,000 views, I got 50,000. That it's really it's a struggle, and this is where it's unavoidable, right? If you're going to do a podcast, if you're going to release a book, it's unavoidable. But if you've cultivated a conversation within your closest relationships, of humility, if you've done some of your inner work, as you all have been doing in counseling, it just doesn't have as much power. And that's what I found. It just doesn't.
That's
You
good.
just don't look at your. I see people who are constantly looking at their Amazon rankings and things like that. It means far less to look at the numbers. It's kind of like, um, it comes and goes, and that's okay.
Yeah.
You live faithfully.
And in a church setting, that's looking at the attendance numbers, it's looking at
Right.
the baptism numbers, all those
Right. All
metrics
that
we
stuff.
use.
That's-
In your profession, because you were talking about how narcissism was really there, I mean, even in the biblical times.
Yeah.
I mean, now, obviously, with social media, I mean, has it just skyrocketed because of that? I mean,
Yeah.
is that what's really causing it all?
Yeah. I mean, so this is where it's complicated, right? I mean, I think that, I mean, I was engaged in this conversation prior to social media, and we were talking about all the many ways that people were getting kind of branding themselves. Back then, it was websites, and then people started blogging. Um, and so it just evolves. I feel like, I remember back in the late 80s, early 90s, when we started seeing some of these televangelists fall, right? Who had these big sort of media platforms on TV. And so the form of media over time changes. I suppose we can all find our outlets. Maybe I don't know what some of the great revivalists, as they went from city to city, town to town. I can't. I guess I can't diagnose, historically, 200-300 years ago. But I wonder, about this
Yeah.
sense of ego, that it's up to me. It's up to me to go from town to town to bring the gospel. So we find new ways, and I think you're right. I think social media has just sort of given us another way of, and now with increased visibility, there's a sense in which, this has become our mirror, and so we wake up in the morning. How many likes did I get? Before it was, the church secretary bringing you the numbers from last Sunday. Now you can
Right.
you can get your hit instantaneously, but we've always found ways to get our hit.
Hmm.
It's just
That's
it's
right.
the new evolution of it.
Yeah.
Chuck, I think a lot of people that listen to this podcast are pastors and wives who are struggling with emotional health, and maybe they haven't had a chance to go and get some counseling, but they're
Okay.
they're getting close. They're
Yeah.
ready to. If they came into your office, I know you're a counselor at heart, and they said, "Hey, we're not sure that we're healthy
Yeah.
in ministry," pastor and his wife. Like, walk us through what are the questions you would ask to even help them get that conversation started?
Yeah. That's good. Well, I do this work. In fact, I do these 5-day counseling intensives with pastors and spouses where I end up sitting with a couple this week where they came in last night, Sunday evening. We spent 3 hours together. And I'll tell you, this is how it often goes, is they come into my office so tired. They're
Mm,
both anxious about it, right? And just weary because of the
yeah.
traumas, plural, of ministry. And so
Mm,
it often starts with, I mean, I don't even have to get the ball rolling sometimes. It often starts with storytelling. Here's the latest thing that happened. We got ghosted by people who we thought were our good friends. They were part of our community
mm,
group, and they just stopped coming. And we're off to the races. But the three questions that I'm doing some writing on this right now, and it may turn into a book. But the three questions that inform me often come from Genesis chapter 3. Where are you? Who told you? And what do you long for? And the third question is sort of my translation of where have you taken your hunger? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat? But where are you? Who told you? And what do you long for? Where are you? Is gets at a kind of a basic diagnostic, like Adam and Eve have hidden, and God is sort of kindly waking them up to their predicament. And sometimes we need to be kindly woken up to our predicament. Who told you? In other words, what voice have you been listening to apart from my voice? And that's the majority of my ministry. I've been listening to other voices, Um, and what do you long for in the deepest sense of that word? Big L longing, big D desire. What do you long for? Um,
mm.
and when I get to that question, I mean, people start to dream again. They realize how tired they are, and they begin to talk about what we long. Maybe you guys got to this point in church planning.
Yeah.
This is the kind of ministry we long for. This is the kind of season in our lives. This is the kind of marriage we long for. And then we really get to the fun part of the counseling work that we do.
Our counselor, the beginning of the session is always the hardest because one of us has to tell a story or share an emotion.
Oh,
And
nice.
I remember the day I told the story about my daughter was getting increasingly close to Lindley and texting her a lot about her personal life, and
Mm,
I discovered it, and it made me feel angry and hurt because I realized that my daughter is gravitating toward her mother, and there's a closer relationship there.
mm,
And how twisted and sick is that? That as a dad, I'm jealous of the
yeah,
relationship my daughter has with my wife. But
yeah,
just saying it out loud that I was hurt or
yeah,
angry forced me to deal with the feeling.
yeah, yeah,
And when we talk to people in ministry, particularly pastors and wives, it's like they've gotten used to not being honest about their feelings
yeah.
and just naming them for what they are
That's right.
and having to deal with them.
Yes,
And so I hope that anybody listening here would
yes.
just take this as one more nudge to go out and get some help from a therapist or a counselor that can invest and listen and encourage, because it has made a massive difference
Mm,
in our marriage and our family life. We have these conversations with our kids. We make our kids talk about their feelings now.
We have
mm,
4 teenagers, and 3 of them are boys, and we'll sit around sometimes, and we have to give them a wheel to choose from.
The
yes,
feelings
Like,
wheel.
yes, yes.
tell one that you're feeling. I mean, and they're spinning it like I
Yeah,
don't know.
yeah.
But
Good for
we
you.
just, well, I mean, we've gotten ourselves into so much trouble, not just being able to name a feeling, and that's when you start to blame.
Hmm.
And so,
Yeah,
that's been a funny thing.
Well,
yeah,
and in ministry, we just get so used to burying feelings
yes,
that we begin to get sick with emotion.
yeah, yeah. That's right.
And
Yeah,
and that's why I so greatly appreciate people who are called to the field that you're in,
yeah.
Chuck,
Thanks.
because it is so important. It really is so important because it doesn't come naturally to process our emotions and
Mm,
feelings.
yeah,
It's a challenge.
yeah, yeah.
So,
Thanks.
last question for you. We don't want to take too much of your time.
Yeah,
This podcast is called The Glass House, and those listening know that being in the public eye comes with pressure. What would you say to the ministry couple who's listening, who just feels all the pressure of
yeah,
ministry and is discouraged? What's a good word you'd give to them?
yeah. Well, I mean, I'd refer 'em back to what you just said, Ben. And I think in that, take your emotions seriously. I think the reality is ministry is lonely, and we do need places to. It is a glass house, right? We do need places to be able to say to someone, therapist, spiritual director, friend, um, I'm lonely. I'm sad. I'm really angry. I
Mm.
feel misunderstood. I feel betrayed. I feel so much shame. We need places like that. And as you said, Ben, both of you said this. I mean, in ministry, we often become disconnected from what's going on. We're so externally focused. And so we're taking care of everyone else, and our marriage dies in the process. And then our emotions come out sideways. It's like you were saying, it kind of gets squeezed to a point that it comes out sideways. I explode on my wife. Where did that come from? Well, it came from a
Yeah.
year's worth of stuffing it all, and so
That's right.
so I'd say keep listening to your podcast, to your audience. Keep listening to this podcast. Subscribe, leave a comment, all that stuff, and
Yeah.
listen to the wisdom of pastors. These two friends and pastors who are saying, "Hey, pay attention to your emotions. Listen within. Have honest relationships. Cultivate depth in your marriage and in your life, and with Jesus."
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Glass House. We would love to include you in the conversation. If something stuck out to you in today's episode, let us hear from you, or a topic you'd love to see us tackle in the future, or just any question you want to fire at Lindley and me. Email us at president@lifeway.com.
The Glass House is hosted by Lifeway, executive produced by Joy Almond, produced and edited by Angie Elkins Media, original music by Robert Elkins, sound engineering by Dale Sandberg, and artwork by Cameron Spooner.